confident as always. But suddenly, a strange metallic sound came from beneath his truck. At first, he thought it was just some debris on the road, but the noise didn't go away. It grew louder and louder. When the trucker finally decided to stop and cut open the tank, he could never have imagined what he would find inside. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sun was only beginning to rise over the horizon when Larry Davis stepped out of the small diner attached to the truck yard. The air was still cool and heavy with the smell of diesel, oil, and the faint sweetness of pancakes drifting from inside. He wiped his hands on a rag, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the back pocket of his jeans. It was a habit formed over years of repetition, everything in its place, every motion deliberate, because life on the road didn't forgive carelessness. His rig stood nearby, an old but dependable Peterbilt that had carried him through every kind of weather and terrain the western states could offer. Its chrome grille reflected the pinkish dawn, and the long trailer behind it loomed like a silent shadow waiting for orders. Larry circled the truck the way a pilot might inspect his plane before takeoff. He crouched to check the tire pressure, ran a hand along the coupling, and listened for the soft hiss of air lines. Every hinge, latch, and cable was familiar to him. Every sound had meaning. To anyone else, the humming and creaking of machinery might seem random, but Larry had learned to hear conversations in those noises. A truck spoke to its driver, and a good driver always listened. The dispatch schedule was simple. Reno to Flagstaff, carrying construction supplies. A long stretch of empty desert, a route he knew like the back of his hand. He preferred such runs, predictable, clean, and quiet. They gave him time to think, and let the miles roll through his mind the same way the scenery rolled past the windshield. As he started the engine, the deep rumble filled his chest like a heartbeat. The gauges flickered to life, needles sliding into their comfortable zones. Fuel, oil, temperature, all green. Everything was just as it should be. The first miles passed in peace. The truck rolled steady along the two-lane highway, the desert still wrapped in dawn's pale light. A coyote darted across the road, a flash of movement that vanished into the sagebrush. Larry sipped coffee from his thermos and glanced occasionally at the mirror. The long silver shape of the trailer stretched perfectly straight behind him. He felt good about this run. Light cargo, fair weather, no rush. For a man like Larry, there was a quiet satisfaction in doing a job right, even when no one was watching. About an hour after sunrise, as he climbed a gentle incline, a faint metallic sound broke through the steady drone of the engine. It was light, almost like the ring of a small tool hitting steel, a quick tick that came and went. Larry frowned slightly, turned down the radio, and listened. Nothing for a while, only the hum of the tires and the low whistle of wind curling around the mirrors. Then it came again. A single metallic note, sharp and misplaced. He dismissed it at first. Maybe a loose wrench in his toolbox, maybe a rock kicked up against the undercarriage. The highway was littered with debris this time of year, and noises like that were part of the job. Still, a corner of his mind marked the moment. The sound didn't return for another 20 miles. When it did, it lingered longer, echoing faintly from beneath the cabin floor. It wasn't loud, just strange. Something about its rhythm didn't belong to the truck's usual symphony. He pressed a little harder on the gas, then eased up, testing whether it changed with speed. The noise came when he hit small bumps, faint but steady, like a spoon striking the inside of a tin can. Larry rubbed his chin, his brow furrowed. He'd heard countless rattles in his life, and most were harmless, but this one had a tone that set his nerves on edge. He decided to stop at the next pull-off area. The truck rolled to a halt beside a stretch of dry scrubland, the engine idling with its deep, rhythmic pulse. He stepped out and was met by the dry wind carrying fine grains of dust across the asphalt. Kneeling beside the truck, he scanned the visible parts beneath the frame. The extra fuel tank, a cylindrical secondary unit mounted along the right side, looked normal. No leaks, no loose fittings. He tapped it lightly with his wrench and listened. The sound that came back was hollow but clean. He crouched lower, checked the mountings, the bolts, the drain plug. Everything seemed intact. He shrugged, stood up slowly, brushed the dust off his pants, and took another long look at the horizon. Nothing out of place. Back in the cabin, he noted the time and wrote a brief line in his logbook. Minor metallic noise undercarriage, possible road debris. He had learned to document everything, no matter how small. With the matter seemingly settled, he shifted back into gear and continued down the highway. But as the sun climbed higher and the temperature rose, the sound returned again. Now it came more often, sharper, almost like a deliberate tap each time the truck hit a minor bump. It was no longer random. Larry adjusted his seat and leaned slightly forward, trying to trace it. It seemed to come from the right side, near that secondary tank again. He narrowed his eyes, glancing at the fuel gauge. The tank wasn't even full. He topped it off only halfway at the last station to keep the load light. There was no reason for a rattle like that. Hours later, he pulled into a large rest stop on the outskirts of Ely, Nevada. The sun was blazing overhead, the metal surfaces of parked trucks shimmering with heat. Larry parked in the shade of a wide awning, cut the engine, and listened to the silence settle in around him. The ringing in his ears from hours of highway noise slowly faded, and there it was again, faint, coming from below, like something shifting lazily in a hollow space. He felt a flicker of irritation. Trucks had their quirks, but this was too persistent. He grabbed his inspection tools from the side compartment, a flashlight, a short crowbar, and a mirror on a telescopic rod. Dropping to one knee, he started another examination. He traced the seams of the auxiliary tank with his fingertips, the metal hot enough to sting. He paused when his thumb caught a faint ridge, an uneven patch along a welded seam. He frowned. The texture was rougher than factory standard, and the weld line looked fresh, the discoloration brighter than the rest of the metal. That was odd. Larry leaned closer, squinting. Around the cap, faint scratch marks ran in a circle, like someone had pried it open recently. He felt a sudden ripple of unease. He stepped back and took in the entire truck again, from the tires up to the mirror arms. It looked the same as always, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had touched it when he wasn't there. He remembered the overnight stop in Reno, a small, crowded parking lot behind a diner. He'd fallen asleep in the sleeper cabin after a 14-hour stretch. When he woke, he'd noticed nothing strange, but that didn't mean nothing had happened. The thought made his stomach tighten. He straightened, wiped his forehead with his sleeve, and took a slow breath. The smart thing was to wait until evening, find a proper service station, and have the tank opened by professionals. But another part of him, the stubborn veteran who trusted his instincts more than anyone else's, told him not to let it wait. Something was wrong, and if he didn't find out what, it might cost him later. He circled back to the driver's side, grabbed a small wrench, and tapped the surface of the secondary tank in measured intervals. The sound that came back was subtly uneven, hollow in some spots, dull in others. That was not how a fuel tank should sound. He crouched lower, his ear almost against the steel. There, an unmistakable shuffle, a muted clink like something solid shifting in the liquid inside. He froze. The tank was supposed to hold diesel and nothing else. Nothing solid should be moving in there. Larry slowly stood up, scanning the rest stop around him. A few truckers lounged near their rigs, smoking or checking phones. Nobody was paying attention. The heat shimmered on the pavement, and the air vibrated faintly with the hum of idling engines. For a moment, the scene looked perfectly ordinary, but under that normalcy lay something quietly sinister. He glanced once more at the strange weld and the marks around the cap. Whatever was going on, it hadn't happened by accident. Someone had tampered with his truck. Someone had put something inside that didn't belong there. He locked the toolbox and climbed back into the cabin, closing the door behind him. The familiar smell of diesel and old upholstery enveloped him, but the comfort it usually brought was gone. He sat motionless for a few seconds, staring through the windshield at the endless stretch of highway ahead. He needed to think. The route to Flagstaff ran mostly through empty desert, hours of nothing but heat and mirages. He couldn't risk driving on with a compromised tank. If there was something unstable in there, a spark or pressure buildup could mean disaster. He exhaled slowly, the decision already forming in his mind. He'd stop again farther down, maybe at a quieter rest area where he could take a better look without drawing attention. He had the tools for a small inspection cut. He could manage it safely. The thought wasn't pleasant, but neither was ignorance. As he started the engine again, the familiar rumble returned, and with it, the faint, stubborn, metallic tap beneath his feet. The road stretched before him like a ribbon of heat and dust, the sun burning white in the sky. Larry gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. He told himself it was probably nothing, but deep down he already knew that the sound was only the beginning of something much larger. The truck rolled forward, merging back onto the highway, carrying him toward whatever waited ahead, toward the moment when he would finally learn what that rattle really meant. The sun had started its slow descent by the time Larry reached the next large stop along the Nevada highway. The light was turning amber, long shadows stretching across the asphalt as the desert began to cool. He pulled his truck into a wide gravel lot on the edge of a rest area, far enough from the other rigs to have privacy, but close enough to the fluorescent lights that flickered above the diesel pumps. The highway hummed in the distance, a low and steady pulse beneath the evening air. Larry turned off the engine and sat for a while, letting the ticking of the cooling metal fade into silence. The faint metallic rattle had grown worse over the last 2 hours, sometimes disappearing, sometimes returning with an odd rhythm as though something inside the tank shifted with each curve in the road. Now, in the stillness, he could almost hear it settle, a faint scrape, like the whisper of metal on metal. Too soft for anyone else to notice, but impossible for him to ignore. He opened the door and climbed down slowly, his knees stiff from the long drive. The wind carried with it the mixed scent of diesel exhaust, hot rubber, and distant sage. Around him, a few other drivers were finishing up their own routines, one wiping his windshield with a dirty rag, another sitting on a cooler talking into his phone. The world looked peaceful, ordinary, the kind of quiet only truckers knew between runs. Yet beneath that peace, Larry felt an undercurrent of unease that hadn't left him since that morning. He couldn't shake the image of those fresh scratch marks, the strange weld line, the sound that didn't belong. He opened the side compartment and pulled out his inspection kit, a flashlight, a small mirror on an extendable rod, and a few wrenches. He crouched down beside the auxiliary tank again, the steel now cooler under his hand. The light from the setting sun bounced off the curved surface, making it difficult to see clearly, so he switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the gathering dusk, revealing every imperfection on the metal skin. The weld still looked too new, too bright. The scratch marks around the access cap were faint but definite, not the kind made by careless maintenance but by deliberate tampering. He leaned closer, tracing the edge of the weld with his gloved finger. It wasn't uniform. Tiny bubbles and inconsistent ridges broke the line. Whoever had done this had worked fast, perhaps at night, using low light and little time. Larry's stomach tightened as he imagined someone crouched beside his truck while he slept in the sleeper cabin, cutting into his tank, inserting something, then sealing it back before dawn. The thought made his skin crawl. He was careful with his vehicle, almost possessive. The idea that someone had violated it while he was unaware felt almost personal, like a break-in at his home. The rest area lights flickered on as dusk deepened, casting long cones of pale yellow across the gravel. Moths began circling them, their wings whispering faintly in the still air. Larry adjusted the mirror rod and slid it under the tank, angling the reflection to inspect the underside. The surface was dirty, streaked with dust and oil, but he spotted something odd. 2 faint lines of discoloration, as though something sticky had dripped down long ago and dried. He scraped a little with the edge of his wrench, revealing a darker residue beneath. It smelled faintly chemical, not like diesel at all. He frowned and sniffed again, his expression hardening. Diesel had a distinct odor, sharp, oily, familiar. This was different, something artificial. He moved around to the opposite side, shining his flashlight into every crevice. Nothing else stood out, yet the feeling that the tank was wrong remained. He stood up, stretched his back, and looked toward the horizon where the last sliver of sunlight burned red against the sky. The desert looked endless from here, empty and serene, but he knew better. Things happened out there. Things that never made the news, that started in quiet places like this, unnoticed by anyone passing by. He climbed into the cabin and opened the glove compartment, pulling out his small maintenance log. He flipped back to earlier entries, his handwriting neat and precise. He found the last service record from 2 weeks ago. The auxiliary tank had been inspected and signed off at a certified station outside Sacramento. No mention of repair or welding. He compared the date with his recent route and realized that the only unmonitored stop had been that night in Reno, the crowded lot behind a diner where he'd slept for 6 hours straight. He remembered waking briefly at one point, hearing distant footsteps, but he'd assumed it was just another driver heading to the restroom. Now he wasn't so sure. The realization settled heavily in his mind. Someone had chosen his truck specifically. They'd had the tools, the time, and the precision to alter his equipment without him noticing. But why? If it had been theft, something would be missing. If it had been sabotage, the damage would be obvious. No, this was something else, something hidden. The weight of it pressed on him as he stared at the darkening sky through the windshield. He rubbed a calloused hand over his face, thinking. He'd handled dozens of mechanical issues in his career. Broken valves, clogged filters, even a cracked axle once. But this wasn't mechanical. This was human. He felt the truth of it deep down, the same way he could feel a change in the road's texture through the steering wheel. Someone had done something deliberate to his truck, and the strange noise inside the tank was proof. Determined now, he stepped out once more and walked around to the passenger side. He set the flashlight on the ground so its beam shone upward, bathing the side of the tank in stark white. Pulling a small rubber mallet from his kit, he began tapping systematically along the surface. The sound it made varied depending on what was behind the metal. Most of it rang hollow, as expected, but when he reached the lower quadrant near the center seam, the tone changed. A dull, muffled thud instead of the usual ring. He tapped again, more carefully. Same result. There was something inside. Something dense, absorbing the sound. Larry felt a jolt of adrenaline surge through him. The rational part of his mind urged caution. He couldn't just start cutting into a fuel tank. It could ignite if vapors were present. But the other part of him, the part that couldn't stand not knowing, was louder. He had handled welding and cutting before. He could do it safely if he vented the tank first and kept a fire blanket handy. He told himself he just needed to confirm his suspicion, to see with his own eyes what was causing the rattle. He gathered his tools from the side locker, a portable cutting torch, a roll of protective fabric, and a small container for drained fuel. Every motion was deliberate, mechanical. He'd done this kind of prep countless times in his life, but never under such circumstances. The rest stop around him had grown quieter now. Most of the other drivers were asleep or inside the cafe. The world felt still, suspended in that strange hour between sunset and true night. He began by loosening the drain valve at the base of the tank, letting a few liters of diesel flow into the container. The fuel trickled out steadily, releasing its sharp, familiar odor. When it slowed to a drip, he tightened it again. The idea wasn't to empty the tank completely, just to reduce pressure and minimize risk. He then unrolled the heat-resistant blanket beneath the area he planned to cut, spreading it flat on the gravel. His flashlight illuminated the weld line he had noticed earlier, and for the first time he saw faint tool scratches near its edge, as if someone had ground down excess metal to hide their work. That confirmed it. This wasn't factory. Someone had tampered here. Larry adjusted the torch and tested the flame. The hiss of gas broke the silence, followed by the steady, focused glow of blue light. He moved slowly, scoring the metal along the edge of the suspicious weld, careful to keep the temperature low enough not to ignite residual fumes. Sparks flickered briefly in the air, falling harmlessly onto the blanket. Sweat formed on his brow despite the cooling night. It wasn't the heat, it was the tension, the awareness that one mistake could end badly. But he pressed on, inch by inch, following the uneven seam until a small portion began to separate. The smell of heated metal filled the air. When the piece finally loosened, he turned off the torch and let the glow fade. The silence that followed was deafening. He took a deep breath and crouched closer, using his flashlight to peer through the narrow gap he had created. The beam cut across the interior, reflecting off the surface of the remaining diesel inside. For a moment, he saw nothing unusual, just the rippling liquid and the gleam of steel. Then something shifted. A small, sealed bundle floated into view, glistening wetly in the fuel. It was rectangular, wrapped in layers of plastic and tape. Larry's heart froze. He blinked, leaned closer. There was more than one. Several similar bundles were wedged along the interior, some partially submerged, others stuck to the walls with magnets or adhesive. Each was tightly sealed, methodically placed. The sight sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't mechanical debris. This wasn't any kind of maintenance mistake. This was contraband. Smuggling of some kind. He sat back on his heels, his pulse hammering. His first thought was disbelief. His second was fear. Whoever had done this had used his truck, his tank as a carrier. He'd been driving across state lines with an illegal cargo hidden inches from his feet. If something went wrong, if police had stopped him or if the tank had ruptured, he'd have been the one in handcuffs. The weight of that realization pressed down like a physical force. Larry switched off the flashlight, his hands trembling slightly. The night around him suddenly felt too open, too exposed. He scanned the lot, half expecting to see someone watching him from the shadows, but the other trucks were quiet, their cabins dark. Only the insects buzzed around the lights. He needed to think, but his thoughts came fast and chaotic. He couldn't just leave it like this. He couldn't drive on, not knowing what was in those packages. He also couldn't touch them. They could contain anything, from drugs to explosives. He needed to call someone. He looked again at the small opening in the tank, the pale reflection of diesel shimmering inside. The bundles were motionless now, caught in the stillness of the liquid, but their presence filled the space with menace. He took a slow breath, his decision forming with clarity. He would close the area as best he could, keep his distance, and contact the authorities first thing. It was too big for one man to handle. As he gathered his tools and doused the torch, the night deepened fully. The moon had risen, cold and distant above the desert, casting silver light across the trucks. Larry packed everything back into its place with methodical precision, every motion steady now that the initial shock was giving way to determination. He knew what he had to do. The discovery had changed everything. His route, his night, maybe even his life, but he would see it through. He took one last look at the auxiliary tank before climbing into the cab. The fresh cut gleamed faintly in the moonlight, the metal still warm to the touch. Inside, hidden among the diesel, the packages waited in silence. Larry sat in the driver's seat, staring through the windshield at the dark horizon. Tomorrow, he thought, this would all come to light. For now, all he could do was stay alert, keep his truck under watch, and prepare for whatever would follow when morning came. The night passed in fragments of half-sleep and vigilance. Larry had parked his truck in the far corner of the rest stop, where the highway lights barely reached and the air smelled of dust and diesel. He couldn't bring himself to climb into the sleeper berth. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those bundles floating inside the tank, swaying slightly in the fuel like ghostly shadows. He sat in the driver's seat instead, the engine off, his flashlight resting on the dashboard, its beam dark. Outside, the world was still. The desert wind hissed softly through the sagebrush, and the low hum of distant semis blended with the rhythmic ticking of cooling metal. Hours crawled by, each one stretching thinner than the last. By the time dawn began to lighten the horizon, his decision was made. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to know exactly what he was dealing with before he called the police. He stepped out of the cab as the first pale light broke over the mountains. The air was sharp and cold, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of fuel and sand. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked around the truck. The auxiliary tank gleamed faintly under the dim orange of a streetlight, the fresh cut he'd made last night visible like a wound. He crouched beside it, running his hand over the metal. It was cool now, smooth except for the scored edge where the torch had sliced through. He pulled his gloves tighter and took a deep breath. The thought of opening it further made his stomach twist, but there was no turning back. He needed to see enough to be sure. His mind tried to rationalize. Maybe it was something harmless, maybe replacement parts, maybe tools. But deep down, he knew better. The deliberate weld, the hidden placement, the plastic wrapping, it was criminal work. and whoever had used his truck had done it with precision. He gathered his tools again: flashlight, crowbar, and wrench. The air was still damp with morning dew, and his breath fogged faintly as he knelt by the tank. He checked the area. No one was around yet. Most of the other truckers were still asleep, their engines silent. A lone cleaner swept near the gas station, his broom whispering softly against the pavement. Larry set the light down and carefully began to pry the edge of the cut wider. The metal resisted with a dull groan, flakes of rust and soot fallen to the ground. The smell of fuel grew stronger, mixing with something acrid and chemical. He coughed, pulled his shirt over his nose, and kept going. The opening widened enough for him to slide his flashlight through. The beam illuminated the shimmering diesel inside, its surface trembling like liquid glass. The packages were still there. He counted 5 of them now, maybe 6, each one the size of a shoebox, tightly sealed, layers of thick plastic and tape glistening with fuel. One had drifted closer to the cut, bumping gently against the inner wall with a soft, wet sound. The sight of it made his pulse spike. He reached for a long steel rod, the kind he used to clear blockages, and slowly dipped it inside. The metal touched the floating bundle, pushing it slightly. It felt solid, heavy, dense enough to sink if not for the trapped air inside the plastic. He withdrew the rod and stared at the faint film of residue that clung to the tip, oily but not pure diesel. It left a faint gray smear that shimmered oddly under the light. He rubbed it between his fingers and felt tiny granules, smooth but not consistent. His mind clicked through possibilities, none of them innocent. Larry stood up, rubbing his temples. The chill morning air suddenly felt heavier, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. He looked around again. A few engines had started up in the distance, but no one paid him any attention. It was a comfort and a danger at once. He was alone, but also unseen. He looked back at the tank, and his jaw tightened. He couldn't just leave it like this. What if something inside reacted, leaked, or corroded through the metal? He needed to get those packages out, at least one, to confirm what they were. Then he'd call the police, report everything, and let them handle it. That was the responsible thing to do. He retrieved a pair of long tongs from his kit and lowered them carefully through the opening. The first attempt slipped. The plastic was slick from the diesel. He steadied his breathing, tried again, and managed to pinch one of the corners of the nearest package. Slowly, he drew it upward, the fuel streaming down in golden lines that sparkled in the early light. When the bundle finally emerged, he laid it on the protective blanket he'd spread beneath the tank. It hit the fabric with a dull, heavy thud. He stepped back instinctively. The thing was wrapped tight, layer upon layer of plastic fused with tape, waterproof and airtight. Fuel dripped off it in slow rivulets, pooling at the corners of the blanket. Larry knelt beside it, hesitant to touch. The smell coming off it wasn't just diesel. It carried something sharp, artificial, and faintly sweet. He reached for his knife and began slicing through the first layer, careful not to puncture deeper. The blade slid through with a sticky resistance, revealing another layer beneath, thicker, darker, wound around like a cocoon. He cut again. A third layer, then a fourth, until finally a small tear opened, revealing something pale beneath, a mass of small, round tablets sealed in a clear inner bag. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each stamped with a tiny symbol. His breath caught. He froze, staring at the pills glimmering faintly under the morning light. The truth hit him with such force that he staggered back onto the gravel. He knew what they were, or at least what they had to be. Drugs, a massive cache of them. He looked at the size of the remaining packages and felt a chill run through him. There wasn't just one. There were many. Tens of thousands of doses hidden inside his truck, riding with him across state lines. For a long time, he didn't move. The only sound was the slow drip of diesel from the tank, the faint hiss of wind brushing across the open lot. Then, finally, his instincts took over. He couldn't stay here, couldn't touch anything else. He had to call for help immediately. He wiped his hands on the blanket, fumbling for his phone in his jacket pocket. His thumb hesitated over the screen for only a second before he dialed 911. The call connected with a crackle, and he gave his name, his location, his license number. His voice was steady but low. He told the dispatcher he'd discovered possible contraband hidden in his truck's auxiliary tank, that he was not involved, that he was alone. The operator's tone turned sharp and professional, instructing him to move away from the vehicle, not to touch anything, and to wait for authorities. He hung up and stared at the truck as though seeing it for the first time. It looked the same as it always had, his loyal machine, clean lines, gleaming steel, but now it was tainted. It wasn't just his truck anymore. It had been used for something dark. He backed away several paces, his boots crunching over the gravel. The sun was climbing higher now, burning through the thin layer of morning haze. A couple of drivers emerged from their rigs, stretching and yawning, oblivious to what lay hidden a few yards away. Larry's hands trembled slightly as he leaned against the side of the fuel pump island, watching the empty road for flashing lights. His mind ran wild with questions. Who had done it? When had they done it? How many other trucks had been used the same way without their drivers ever realizing? Minutes passed like hours until, finally, he heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance. It started low and grew louder, bouncing off the hills. Relief mixed with dread in his chest. He waved his arm as the patrol cars approached, their lights flashing red and blue against the sunlit desert. They came to a stop in a cloud of dust, and uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions focused, alert. One approached him carefully, while the others began assessing the area. Larry stayed where he was, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of cooperation. As the officers secured the perimeter, the lead investigator, a tall man with mirrored sunglasses, cautiously examined the open tank. He peered inside, then signaled to another officer to call for a hazmat team. Within minutes, more vehicles arrived. A van marked State Narcotics Division, a pair of technicians in protective gear, and a forensic photographer. Larry watched as they surrounded his truck, methodical and efficient. He felt strangely detached from it all, as though watching someone else's story unfold. The technicians used long tongs similar to his to extract the remaining bundles. Each one was placed in a sealed container, labeled, photographed, and loaded into the van. One of them broke open a sample under supervision, revealing more of the same pale tablets. They ran quick field tests using portable analyzers. The results were immediate and grim. The officer whispered something to the lead investigator, who nodded and scribbled in his notebook. Larry caught a few words when the investigator turned back toward him. MDMA, distribution grade, 500,000 street value. The realization sank deeper, twisting in his chest. He had been unknowingly hauling a fortune in narcotics across 3 states. If anything had gone differently, a random inspection, a minor accident, he would have been finished. His record, his livelihood, everything he'd worked for, gone in an instant. He thought of all the nights he'd parked in lonely truck stops, the times he'd trusted strangers offering small favors, the countless moments when someone could have tampered with his rig. The world suddenly felt colder, smaller, more dangerous. As the officers continued their work, Larry found himself drifting into a strange calm. His mind was empty, his thoughts dulled by exhaustion and disbelief. He watched the sun climb higher, its light glinting off the now open tank, off the sheen of spilled diesel on the blanket, off the flashing lenses of the forensic cameras. The smell of fuel and chemicals mingled in the air, acrid and oppressive. Somewhere behind him, the dispatcher's voice crackled over a radio, calling in details. He didn't listen. His eyes stayed fixed on the tank, on the dark hollow where the packages had been. It was over, at least for now. The hidden cargo was out, the truth exposed. But deep inside, Larry knew this was only the beginning. Whoever had used his truck hadn't done it randomly. There was a system behind it, a plan too precise to target just one man. As he stood there, the desert stretching endless and empty around him, a single thought repeated in his mind. This had been no accident. Someone had chosen him, and somewhere out there, the people responsible would soon realize their cargo was gone. The wind picked up again, sweeping dust across the lot, blurring the footprints and the scattered drops of diesel. The officers' voices faded into background noise. Larry turned his gaze to the horizon, where the road shimmered beneath the heat. He felt the weight of fatigue settle on his shoulders, but also a strange, grim clarity. His life had just changed forever, and there would be no going back to the quiet rhythm of long roads and engine hum. Something larger had begun, and whether he liked it or not, he was now part of it. The sound of the sirens had been both a relief and an escalation. Their approach carved the morning air into sharp, expectant slices. As the patrol cars rolled in and came to a halt with the efficiency of a rehearsed choreography, Larry felt the scene shift from private discovery to public procedure. Uniformed officers spilled out of their vehicles, moving with methodical purpose, their faces set and their gestures economical. They spread out, placing bright orange cones and cordoning tape around the truck and the immediate area, creating a small scene in the middle of the otherwise indifferent rest stop. The truck that had been only his for so long was suddenly an object of evidence, and the ordinary rituals of a driver's life, the smell of coffee, the comfortable clutter of the cab, the checked tires, fell under the strange light of scrutiny. He stood aside, a spectator to the arrest of the ordinary by the extraordinary, feeling both exposed and vindicated. The lead officer approached with a quiet, efficient manner and asked for his identification, which Larry provided without hesitation. There were no questions about cooperation. His actions had been transparent, his hands visibly clean of anything but diesel. An officer photographed Larry's hands, his jacket, the documents he had produced, and then guided him through a brief intake process that was all protocol and no small talk. He was led a short distance away from the truck to a folding chair under the awning where the investigators could work without his looming presence influencing their handling of the scene. He could see them then in small, focused groups, 2 technicians in bright protective suits kneeling at the crack of the tank, a photographer taking meticulous images from different angles, another officer dusting for prints on the exterior panels and the areas around the cut he had made. Every movement had an intent, every photograph a future reference. The truck's silhouette lost its singularity and became a collection of data points to be recorded, cataloged, and analyzed. The forensic technicians worked with an almost surgical attention to detail. They wore gloves and filters over their mouths and noses, the fabric of their suits rustling softly as they shifted positions. One technician produced a small portable analyzer and performed preliminary chemical swabs on the residue around the cut, while another carefully retrieved and sealed the first of the extracted packages in a tamper-evident bag. The packages were treated not like commodities, but like fragile, dangerous objects. They were photographed on the blanket, weighed, and then double-bagged with a numbered evidence tag attached and recorded in a physical log, each entry written in deliberate, legible script. The notion of chain of custody was invoked in every step, as if every handling might become the central fact in a later court argument. Larry watched all of it without interjecting. His body was still, his eyes tracking the procession of tasks, the lifting and lowering of hands, the use of labeled trays and plastic tubs meant for safe transport. A small team interviewed the surrounding area for witnesses in a way that revealed the investigators' priorities. One officer walked the length of the rest stop, looking into the faces of drivers who squinted in the sun, searching for anyone who might have seen a stranger at night, anyone who might remember the sound of an engine idling late or the flash of reflected metal in the dark. Another officer took statements from the maintenance worker who had been sweeping, from the attendant at the pump who kept the keys to the lot's scant security cameras, and from a diner waitress who came out on a cigarette break and craned her neck to see the commotion. Each interview was recorded not as an intrusion, but as a procedural necessity. They asked for times, for details that seemed trivial. What time had the cleaning started? Had anyone unusual been seen parking late? Had anyone come in asking for tools or paid for a strange repair? The fragments accumulated into a pattern. The unattended lot in Reno where Larry had slept, a couple of vans in the shadows at odd hours, someone who remembered a figure crouched near a line of rigs the previous night, but couldn't say more than that. These recollections were nothing conclusive on their own, but layered together they gave the investigators something to hold. The technicians moved carefully to document the tank itself. They photographed the fresh weld line and the prying marks around the cap, using a high-resolution camera to capture minute details invisible to the naked eye. They took small scrapes of the residue so that the lab could run a thorough analysis, and they threaded tiny swabs into crevices to collect residues that might reveal fingerprints, fibers, or other forensic traces. A plastic bag containing the torn strip from the weld area received its own numbered tag, then a secondary seal as part of the evidence procedure. Nothing was overlooked. Everything became eligible for comparison in a laboratory database. The technicians also measured and recorded the dimensions of the auxiliary tank, noting the position of magnets and adhesive that suggested the packages had been fastened into place rather than merely tossed in. The pattern of attachment suggested deliberation. These were not accidental or opportunistic acts of concealment. They were calculated, engineered to move through thousands of miles without drawing attention. The field tests returned results that turned the loose hairline of suspicion into a clean, stark line. The tablets were identified in the first screening as MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy, and high-purity distribution-grade pills at that. The words the investigator used as he reported back, words Larry had no prior knowledge of beyond hearsay, landed like stones. Distribution, modular concealment, cross-border trafficking. The technicians handled the result with efficiency, but the implication was immediate and visceral. The packages were not merely contraband. They represented an organized effort to exploit long-haul trucks as clandestine conveyances for high-value illegal commodities. The amount recovered placed the value of the seizure well into six figures. At once, the scale of the operation became concrete. This was no small-time smuggling attempt. It was the movement of a commercial-scale shipment hidden inside the belly of an ordinary vehicle. As more units arrived, a state narcotics van, An agent with federal insignia, conversations turned from on-site procedure to investigative direction. The federal representative requested copies of Larry's logs and fuel receipts and began to cross-reference dates and locations with known incidents. Investigators ran the truck's VIN against databases, searched for prior stops, and pulled the manifest for the load he carried. A pattern emerged from this cross-referencing. The stop in Reno, where Larry had slept, a similarly timed gap the previous week at a different lot, overlapping locations where other drivers later reported suspicious visits from nighttime repairmen. The investigators' focus sharpened toward a method. Pick a driver, pick a truck, find an exposed moment, often at a crowded rest stop or a facility with lax oversight, and alter a vehicle while its owner was asleep or distracted. The sophistication lay not in one bold act, but in the predictability of the route and the social vulnerabilities of a profession long accustomed to favors and spontaneity. Larry was asked to produce receipts, to walk through his night's events, to list every stop, every odd encounter. He handed over what he had: fuel logs, a nap receipt, the times he'd clocked in and out. He could feel the way the officers cataloged the seemingly mundane details as if they were pieces of a mechanism. Each time, stamp a gear, each gas station a potential node for interception. The agent took notes and then leaned back, considering the web of locations. In the absence of explicit admissions from a suspect, the pattern of physical evidence and the corroborating witness fragments provided the shape of culpability. The investigators' immediate conclusion was cautious in its language, but firm in its implication. The tampering had likely occurred at one of the stops between Reno and the point where Larry resumed his route. Whoever had done it had left fingerprints not only on the metal of the tank, but also on the logistics of the route itself. With that assessment, a decision was made to review security camera footage from the lots Larry had traversed. Officers called the proprietors of each stop, subpoenaed footage where available, and began the painstaking process of scrolling hours of nighttime video. What the cameras revealed was fragmentary. A low van lingering at the edge of a lot. Two figures in dark clothing moving in awkward, hurried patterns among the rigs, the flash of a handheld light against a belly of steel. In other locations, the footage showed men who matched the description of transient mechanics moving along rows of trailers with toolboxes in hand, their faces obscured by caps. While none of the images constituted a definitive identification, the sequence built a geographic narrative. The investigators matched timestamps with Larry's own timeline and found overlap with the hours he could not account for. The videos did more than suggest a method. They demonstrated the audacity of the scheme, to work in plain sight at night where complacency and fatigue made drivers vulnerable. Back at the scene, the lead investigator took a closer look at the signature knot one of the technicians had noticed earlier on the packaging inside the tank. It was a seemingly trivial detail, a particular winding of tape and a small loop of cord used to secure the inner bag. To an untrained eye, it was nothing. But in the world of illicit logistics, repeat patterns have meaning. The investigator compared photographs of the knot to images from a database of known smuggling patterns and discovered matches to at least two other unrelated seizures in the region from the prior months. That tiny loop of cord, this little loop of signature craftsmanship became in their hands an identifying mark. It implied the same operation, the same hands, maybe even the same person or group responsible for the concealment. The recognition of such a pattern elevated the case from an isolated incident to a probable element of a broader trafficking network. While the evidence team collected paperwork and sealed the last of the packages into transport crates, Larry sat with an officer who went over the immediate legal implications for him as a driver. He was not being accused. His cooperation and the integrity of his report had been convincing. Nevertheless, he was advised that he would be a witness in any forthcoming investigation and, if necessary, in trial. His vehicle would undergo a complete inspection and possibly be held as evidence for a period. The agent explained, in a tone devoid of drama, that there would be interviews, that the company might launch its own audit, and that the process would be far from quick. Larry absorbed this information with the peculiar detachment of someone feeling the world tilt slightly on its axis. The truck he had trusted, the routes he had memorized, the nights of lonely stops, all of it now marked by an external system that would re-examine each step under a harsh, forensic light. By midday, the scene had transitioned into a coordinated operation. The narcotics unit drove the packages away in a sealed van. The truck was flagged for transport to a secure facility for full decontamination and detailed mechanical forensics. The investigators left behind a roster of contact numbers and instructions for Larry to preserve any objects he might later find and to refrain from public statements. The rest stop slowly returned to its usual rhythms. Coffee cups were refilled, conversations resumed, engines started, but the texture of those ordinary actions felt different in the wake of what had been uncovered. Larry watched as his truck was prepared for towing. He walked the perimeter one last time, touching nothing, committing details to memory. The way the sun struck the rim of the tank, the precise position of the cut, the faint dark smear where the packages had rested. These were his anchors now. These were the coordinates he would return to in the weeks ahead when officials asked him to recall, to confirm, to testify. As the tow truck hitched his rig and the driver eased forward, the consequent motion felt less like departure than like a transfer of custody. The truck that had been a solitary instrument of work was now an object within a larger legal and investigative apparatus. Larry climbed back into his own cab with a clarity that had not been there before. He was exhausted, not only from the night's interrupted sleep but from the sudden acceleration of responsibility. The investigators had begun to sketch the outlines of a case that reached beyond a single tank or a single rest stop. They had begun to see the margins of a network that used the anonymity of long-haul trucking to move dangerous, high-value goods. For Larry, the immediate relief was that he had done what was right. The relief was tempered, however, by the knowledge that this discovery would ripple outward, through courts, through news cycles, through the lives of drivers and the policies of rest stops. The rest stop itself felt smaller now, its corners more watched, its late-night favors more suspect. He understood, with a hard, new certainty, that he would never again treat the ordinary interactions of the road as incidental. The world, once simply a path to travel, had become a place requiring renewed suspicion and renewed care, and the first investigations had made that truth impossible to ignore. The rest stop that had once been a quiet blip on Larry Davis's route was now a place carved into his memory, but the road didn't wait for memories. The truck, now in custody at a state evidence facility, was being examined by a team of mechanical specialists and forensic analysts. Larry, for his part, had been released with no charges, no suspicion of involvement, and with more apologies than he knew what to do with. But absolution didn't restore normalcy. It didn't clear the film from his thoughts or stop the sound of the clinking packages from echoing in his head when he lay in silence. The company he hauled for had placed him on administrative leave pending review, a neutral gesture they framed as routine, but that still felt like a temporary exile. He found himself at a motel on the edge of a small town just east of Ely, Nevada, not far from where the seizure had taken place, sitting in a room with a weak fan, thin curtains, and the kind of silence that made clocks seem louder than they were. The investigators had been careful not to promise conclusions, but they had asked questions, many of them. They'd wanted to know where he'd stopped before Reno, who had access to his rig, whether he'd noticed anyone lingering near the tank. They asked about every maintenance stop over the past month, any unusual conversations, any offers of help. It was only after hours of this that one of the agents, a man with a clipped tone and a badge bearing the insignia of a federal narcotics task force, mentioned the wider scope. Larry wasn't just an isolated incident. There were other reports now surfacing, other trucks, other drivers who, like him, had begun to notice strange noises or odd behavior from their vehicles. A driver in Utah had found foreign wiring tucked inside his cabin wall. Another in Arizona had discovered a false bottom in his reefer unit. Each had passed through the same belt of truck stops in the western corridor. Each had stopped, at least once, at the same locations. The method was clearer now. The smugglers weren't trying to bribe drivers or recruit them. They were bypassing them altogether. They were modifying trucks during overnight stops, selecting vehicles based on their routes and schedules, targeting lone drivers who wouldn't notice subtle changes or who parked in less lit corners of big lots. It was a parasitic operation. Clean trucks, clean drivers, corrupted only in the mechanical dark. They used vehicles like Larry's not as accomplices, but as vessels, intercepting them for a few quiet hours and transforming them into tools of silent transport. It was brilliant, in a way, and deeply unsettling. Larry had spent decades building a reputation for professionalism and discipline, and in a single night that trust had almost been turned into a weapon against him. He sat in that motel room watching a muted television and thinking about how close he'd come to becoming collateral. What if he hadn't heard the rattle? What if the tank had leaked or caught fire or been flagged at a random checkpoint? Would he have been believed then? Would his quiet diligence and years of clean records have mattered in the face of a tank full of drugs? He imagined sitting in a courtroom explaining to a jury that he hadn't known, that someone had tampered with his truck, and he saw their skeptical faces. No, he'd been lucky. Not smart, not heroic, just lucky enough to hear a sound that didn't belong and stubborn enough to follow it. That stubbornness had drawn attention. 2 days after the seizure, Larry was contacted by one of the agents leading the investigation. They had been reviewing footage from several truck stops along Interstate 80, and one pattern had emerged again and again. A white service van with no markings, often parking close to long-haul rigs late at night. The driver appeared on camera only briefly. Never a full face, never a clear shot, but the outline was always the same. Medium build, working gloves, a heavy canvas jacket. In one clip from Reno, the van had parked beside Larry's truck for just under 17 minutes. The timestamp aligned almost perfectly with the period Larry remembered hearing faint noise just before falling into a deeper sleep. The van had been traced to a rental service in Central California, but the paperwork was forged. The renter had used stolen ID, and the listed phone number was disconnected. The surveillance trail ended there, but investigators suspected the same van had been seen in at least 3 other states. It was a ghost on the road, always arriving after dark, always leaving before dawn. Its presence meant something specific and chilling. Someone had selected Larry's truck, had approached it with equipment, had altered it in less than 20 minutes, and then vanished without leaving behind a single clear image. Larry asked the question he had been avoiding. Why him? Why his truck? The agent didn't answer directly. Instead, he explained how the selection process might work. Vehicles with certain tags, certain patterns of movement, solo operators, known rest stops with poor lighting. It was impersonal. They hadn't chosen Larry Davis, the man. They had chosen truck hash 2846, running Route 93, with predictable habits and regular stops. That somehow was worse. It wasn't betrayal. It was indifference. They hadn't cared who he was at all. After the call ended, Larry found himself unable to sit still. He stepped outside, walking past rows of identical motel doors, the air thick with the scent of asphalt and ozone from a storm that hadn't yet come. He crossed into the empty lot across the street, where discarded tires leaned against a rusted chain-link fence, and just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring into the distance. There were no answers here, only a mounting sense that something bigger than him had brushed against his life and left it changed. The next morning brought confirmation that the case was expanding. The investigators had compiled data from toll booths, gas purchases, and maintenance records. Patterns emerged. The same fuel cards had been used in distant locations within implausible timeframes. GPS anomalies suggested that several trucks had made unauthorized stops during nighttime hours, stops the drivers themselves didn't recall. Someone was using the infrastructure of logistics itself to orchestrate these insertions, and worse still, a few of the trucks were found abandoned after accidents, their drivers missing. One, they told him quietly, had been found burned out on a remote access road in eastern Oregon. Nothing left to identify. Another driver had disappeared entirely. His last known location a rest stop just outside Albuquerque. Larry began to feel the edges of paranoia pulling at him. Had someone followed him? Was he still being watched? After all, the smugglers had lost $500,000 worth of product. That kind of money didn't just disappear without consequence. He started noticing small things. A car parked a little too long across the street from his motel. A man in a hoodie at the gas station who turned away when Larry looked up. Were they just coincidences? Or were these signs that someone had noticed he'd disrupted something they counted on? The fear grew sharper when he returned from lunch one afternoon to find his motel door slightly ajar. Nothing inside was stolen. His bags were untouched and his wallet was still in the drawer where he had left it. But his travel logbook, the same one he'd handed over to investigators, was out on the bed, open to a blank page. It hadn't been there when he left. The message was clear. We know who you are. We've been here, and we could come back. He reported it immediately. The police took his statement, dusted for prints, and found nothing. No forced entry, no video evidence. Just an open page in a silent room. After that, they moved him to a different location, one kept confidential. His phone was temporarily replaced with a secure line. Agents monitored his calls. They told him, gently but firmly, not to go anywhere alone. And in those precautions, he heard the truth they weren't saying. There was danger now. Not imagined, not abstract, real and close. The investigation pressed on. More drivers came forward, sharing stories of unusual noises, forgotten hours, or unexplained changes in their rigs. A map was built. Dozens of incidents, all pointing to a centralized intelligence behind the operation. Each new report added another thread to the network, pulling it tighter, revealing more of its shape. The authorities began focusing their resources on a small number of truck stops known to be poorly monitored. Undercover officers were deployed. Decoy trucks were prepared, equipped with hidden cameras and GPS beacons designed to look vulnerable, designed to lure out whoever had been working in the shadows. Larry wasn't told the full scope of the plan, but he didn't need to be. He understood the stakes now. What had started with a single sound in a fuel tank had turned into a hunt for a hidden machine, an organization operating silently across state lines, co-opting the movements of an industry that thrived on rhythm and reliability. The network wasn't just a group of criminals. It was a system built to blend in, to mimic the patterns of everyday logistics, to hide in plain sight. It was everywhere and nowhere. The threat didn't just linger, it evolved. As the authorities moved closer to their targets, the enemy adapted. The white van disappeared from known routes. Surveillance footage dried up. The smugglers changed methods, targeting newer trucks, using drones for drop-offs, corrupting garage mechanics for silent modifications. Larry realized then that this wouldn't be over with one arrest or one trial. This was a long war, and he had simply stumbled into the front line. And yet, despite the fear, the disruption, and the weight of what he now carried, there was something else growing inside him. A sense of purpose. A refusal to be silent. He knew the roads. He knew the people. He had credibility among drivers and mechanics. If he could speak, warn, share his story, maybe others wouldn't be caught off guard. Maybe they'd hear the rattle. Maybe they'd check the weld. Maybe they'd live. But even as that resolve began to harden into something like conviction, the danger remained. The knock at the door could still come. The next stop might still be compromised. The van could return. In the shadows of the network, retaliation was just another kind of logistics. He lay awake most nights now, listening to the wind against the motel windows, remembering the weight of that package in his gloved hands. The threat had passed him, but it had not vanished. It had simply gone quiet again, waiting, watching, adjusting, and Larry Davis, veteran trucker, unwilling witness, accidental key to unraveling a secret highway empire, understood one thing with absolute certainty. The road ahead would never be the same. The sun had just begun its slow rise over the ridge when the message came. It wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no encrypted files, no coded phrases. Just a simple call on the secure phone Larry had been issued, the kind of sterile, official tone that carried weight without emotion. The agent's voice was brisk and steady. The time had come. The operation they had hinted at for days was now in motion. The trap was set, the decoy truck in place, and they needed Larry nearby, not for confrontation, not for action, but for identification. His presence wasn't tactical. It was human. He'd seen one of the men before, fleetingly, during a late-night encounter at a Reno truck yard. He might recognize them again, even if the face was obscured by the brim of a cap or the flicker of shadow across a collar. Sometimes justice required more than data. Sometimes it needed memory. They moved him discreetly. No uniforms, no badges. Just a plain car with tinted windows and two agents in worn leather jackets, more mechanic than lawman. The vehicle hummed softly as they drove eastward, past sleepy towns not yet stirring, toward a rest stop that looked like 1,000 others, unassuming, functional, ordinary in every way. That was the point. The entire operation depended on it appearing unremarkable. The lot had been prepared carefully. A decoy truck, almost identical to the one Larry had driven, was parked in the far corner under a faulty light that flickered at irregular intervals. It was deliberate. The flicker gave just enough darkness to mask movement, but enough light to keep cameras active. A temporary surveillance trailer had been set up nearby, its exterior disguised as a roadside maintenance unit. Inside, it was a nest of monitors, microphones, and live feeds. Larry was led into it silently, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality. He sat before a row of screens, each showing a different angle of the lot. A tech adjusted dials, switching views between infrared and standard, audio overlay humming quietly beneath the images. The rest of the world seemed impossibly far away. The heat of the Nevada sun still below the horizon, the chill of morning air clinging to the metal skin of the trailer. The only sounds were the hum of the monitors and the occasional static of shortwave communication. Then came the alert. A white van, unmarked and unremarkable, pulled into the lot at 4:17 a.m., headlights dimmed, moving slowly across the gravel. It matched the descriptions, the footage, the reports. The driver remained unseen, the window glass dark and angled just enough to obscure the face. But the posture, the profile, the careful precision, it all matched. The agents didn't move. No sirens, no rush. They watched. The van rolled to a stop beside the decoy truck. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the passenger door opened, and a figure stepped out. Medium build, canvas jacket, gloves, a cap pulled low. He approached the auxiliary tank on the truck and knelt beside it, his hands working quickly and confidently. The camera zoomed in. He had tools, a wrench, a cutting device, and a small thermal tool designed to melt adhesive. He moved with purpose, checking the weld, reaching into a side bag for a pre-wrapped package. It was as if he'd done it 100 times. Larry leaned forward, his jaw clenched. It wasn't just the method, it was the man. He recognized him, not a name, not a full face, but a memory. The same man who had walked through the Reno yard under the cover of darkness, the same frame, the same gait. Larry's heart beat harder in his chest. The tech beside him switched to another angle. The image sharpened. The man's face turned briefly toward the side mirror of the truck. There was just enough light. Larry nodded slowly. That was him. The agent beside him picked up a handheld radio and spoke a phrase Larry didn't catch. Within seconds, the scene outside changed. From the surrounding area, figures emerged, plainclothes officers in staggered positions converging in silence. The suspect didn't notice them until they were already within 10 feet. The moment was fast, clinical. Shouts, movement, the suspect backing away, hands raised. He didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, expression unreadable, as the officers secured him and pulled him away from the truck. The other agents swarmed the van, opening its rear doors to reveal several packages already prepped for insertion, each sealed and marked. The interior was lined with tools, blueprints, lists of license plates. A mobile workshop built for efficiency. Back in the surveillance trailer, Larry exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes. The tension that had built inside him since the day he cut into his own tank now began to drain, slowly, like air from a pressurized line. The agent turned to him, one brow slightly raised. "That's the man." Larry nodded again. There was nothing else to say. Later, in the debriefing room, they showed him more evidence. The van had been outfitted with a scanner capable of reading RFID tags, allowing the smugglers to track the routes and stops of trucks belonging to specific logistics companies. The man they'd arrested had a network behind him. Emails, burner phones, coded notes, even route projections for the following weeks. The plan had been systematic. rooted in cold calculation. The drivers were selected not because of anything personal, but because of their patterns, their schedules, their predictability. Larry felt an odd mix of anger and relief. It was never about him, and yet it had everything to do with him. But the operation wasn't over. The arrested man was a node in the system, not its source. More arrests would follow. More layers would be peeled away. What remained now was choice. Larry's role in the case was shifting. He was no longer just a witness. He was a key. His story, his voice, his willingness to speak publicly could help bring the scale of the operation into view. The agent laid it out for him plainly. There would be a trial, and his testimony could be critical. There might be risk, but there would be support, protection, a chance to make sure others didn't fall into the same trap. Larry didn't answer immediately. He walked alone for a while through the edge of the city, the air warming around him, the buildings casting long shadows on empty sidewalks. He passed trucks parked along the street, drivers asleep in their cabs, unaware of how vulnerable they were. He remembered every detail of his own experience, the sound in the tank, the texture of the cut, the smell of fuel and fear. He had seen what could happen when a man stayed silent. And now he was being asked if he would speak. He thought about the weight of that choice, about the drivers who would never know they'd been used, about the ones who had disappeared, about the families waiting for them, unaware their loved ones had become tools in someone else's plan. He thought about the silence that surrounded this network, how easily it had hidden in plain sight. And he understood something with total clarity. Silence was what had allowed it to grow. To speak was not only a risk, it was a responsibility. When he returned to the agent's office, he nodded once. Yes, he would testify, he would lend his story, his voice, his presence to the case. Whatever came, he would not turn away. The road had given him a life, a purpose. Now it asked for courage in return. In the days that followed, preparations began. His testimony would be recorded and delivered in segments. He was given security protocols, alternate lodging, limited contact with outside parties. The process was slow, often tedious but deliberate. Every word mattered. Every recollection had to be exact. He worked closely with attorneys, agents, and technical experts. He relived the events over and over, each retelling sharpening the truth, each retelling deepening his resolve. During those long sessions, he thought often of his truck. It had been returned to him finally, after weeks of analysis and repair. The auxiliary tank had been removed and replaced entirely. The interior sanitized, the wiring inspected, the frame certified. The keys had been handed back to him by a quiet agent with a simple gesture. But when Larry stepped into the cab again, it felt different. Not unfamiliar, just changed. Like a place that had endured something and come out the other side. He ran his fingers across the dashboard, the same as he always had, but now the motion held weight. Memory. He had once believed the road was just a place to pass through, that solitude and motion were the only things a man needed. But now he saw something deeper. The road was a mirror. It reflected back what a man chose to carry, and for Larry, that weight had become more than cargo. It had become cause. He began driving again, slowly at first, taking only local runs, short distances with familiar faces. But word had already spread. Other drivers stopped him at rest stops, asked questions, shared their own suspicions. He listened. He told them to check their welds, to trust their instincts, to never ignore a sound that didn't belong. Some of them laughed nervously, unsure if he was exaggerating. Others nodded with understanding, the kind that only comes from experience. Larry didn't push. He just shared what he knew and moved on. The rest was up to them. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't looking for praise. He only wanted to make sure that what had happened to him didn't happen again, or at least not without warning. And in the quiet moments when the road stretched ahead and the sky opened wide above the asphalt, he thought of what he'd seen, what he'd done, and the choice he had made. It had not been easy, but it had been right. That, in the end, was enough. The tank was empty now, but something inside him had filled in its place, something that hummed not with fear, but with clarity. The kind of clarity only born in the heart of confrontation. The kind that stays with a man long after the engines fade and the wheels stop turning. The morning sun spilled over the horizon like molten gold, painting the desert in hues of ochre and amber. Larry Davis adjusted his seat in the cab, feeling the familiar vibration of the engine beneath him. A pulse steady and reassuring after the months of tension and uncertainty that had overtaken his life. The road stretched endlessly ahead, its asphalt ribbon glimmering in the heat, and he felt a strange mixture of relief and wariness. The operation had concluded, at least the part that required his direct involvement, but the repercussions were only just beginning to settle into the rhythm of his life. Every mile he traveled now carried the weight of what had transpired, every familiar landmark tinted with memories of suspicion and discovery. He remembered the sound that had first alerted him, the faint metallic rattle that had turned into an unwelcome revelation, and he realized that he would never again hear the hum of his rig without thinking of it. His truck had been returned to him after the thorough inspections and repairs mandated by the authorities. The auxiliary tank had been replaced entirely, all wiring rechecked, all seams resealed, the mechanical integrity certified beyond doubt. Still, Larry approached the vehicle as though it were a stranger, his hands lingering over the polished metal, checking bolts and welds as if by habit alone. Every panel, every joint, every latch was scrutinized with the caution of a man who had learned that perfection on the surface could hide danger beneath. The rig had endured inspection, but the memory of its betrayal remained. He reminded himself that it was the same truck he had trusted for decades, and yet he could not help but view it differently now. It had been both vessel and trap, silent accomplice to a crime he had only narrowly avoided being implicated in. The first trips back into the familiar rhythm of the highway were tentative. Larry chose routes he knew intimately, sticking to stretches he had traversed countless times. Each stop was carefully examined before he shut off the engine. He moved his flashlight under the chassis, tapped lightly on panels, and ran fingers along welds. He checked the mounting of every auxiliary tank, the integrity of every latch, even the feel of the tires for irregularities. Every routine act of preparation now carried the additional weight of vigilance, an awareness that even the smallest oversight could have catastrophic consequences. The road had always demanded attention, but now it demanded more. Not just skill and endurance, but foresight, intuition, and an unrelenting skepticism of appearances. News of the seizure and the operation had made its way through the trucking community. Other drivers stopped him at rest areas, leaning against their rigs as they shared experiences, raised questions, or simply nodded in understanding. Some of their tales were minor, the sound of something shifting in a fuel tank, an odd vibration that had seemed innocuous. Others were darker. Trucks found abandoned with tampered tanks, drivers reporting strange late-night visitors, packages discovered hidden within cargo. Larry listened without judgment, absorbing each story and offering guidance where he could. He spoke cautiously, careful not to reveal sensitive details that the authorities had asked to remain confidential, but he emphasized awareness, vigilance, and the importance of trust and instincts. He realized that his own experience, harrowing though it had been, had granted him credibility, a voice among the drivers who were otherwise isolated and unaware. The authorities had continued their investigation, peeling back layers of the network that had used long-haul trucks as unwitting carriers. Arrests were made, operations disrupted, and a clearer picture of the organized system emerged. A chain of individuals who had adapted and evolved, learning to exploit gaps in monitoring, familiar routes, and predictable driver behavior. While the immediate threat to him had passed, Larry knew the broader network remained. Not all players had been apprehended, not all methods exposed. The system was resilient, adaptive, and capable of hiding in plain sight. Awareness and caution were now as crucial as skill and experience on the highway. Larry's own schedule shifted to accommodate both work and involvement in the investigation. He provided testimony, detailed logs, and identification of suspects during controlled operations. The authorities ensured his safety, offering secure lodging and limited public exposure. He traveled carefully, aware that the very vigilance that had saved him might still be needed in subtle ways, watching for vehicles that lingered too long, observing unfamiliar faces at rest stops, noticing odd patterns in the rhythm of traffic. These precautions became second nature, integrated seamlessly into the motions that had once been purely mechanical and routine. Despite the ever-present awareness of risk, life on the road slowly resumed its cadence. Larry found comfort in small routines. The sound of the engine at idle, the feel of the steering wheel beneath his hands, the vibration of tires against asphalt, the scent of fuel and dust carried on desert winds. Each trip was an affirmation, a reclamation of the control that had once been taken from him. Yet, the memory of the packages, the metallic rattle, the near miss with entrapment remained a constant companion. It was not fear, but a reminder, a persistent lesson etched into muscle memory and mind alike. Interactions with other drivers became a conduit for vigilance. Larry shared what he could without jeopardizing the investigation, warning them to check welds, inspect tanks, and remain aware of sounds that seemed unusual. He encouraged routine scrutiny at every stop, emphasizing patterns and behaviors that often went unnoticed. The information spread quietly but effectively, creating a ripple of awareness that extended beyond the immediate operation. He realized that his story and the choices he had made could prevent others from being compromised. In that sense, the journey itself, long, lonely, punctuated by stops and starts, became a vehicle for safety, knowledge, and preparedness. He also contemplated the broader implications for the industry. The methods used by the network were ingenious in their simplicity, relying not on force or intimidation, but on predictability and routine. Trucking routes, schedules, rest stops, and the trust inherent in the profession had been leveraged against the drivers themselves. The system had exploited patterns, using the very rhythm of the road to mask illicit activity. Larry understood now that vigilance could not be selective. It had to be constant, integrated, instinctual. The highway, the vehicles, the trucks, the rest stops, they were all part of a dynamic ecosystem where awareness was survival. Larry's nights were quieter now, but sleep came slowly. He would lie awake in his temporary lodging, the desert night stretching beyond the thin walls, listening for sounds that weren't there, replaying the metallic rattle in his mind. His dreams were punctuated by blurred images of trucks, packages, and surveillance cameras. Yet, with each dawn, he rose with a sense of determination. He drove, checked his equipment, planned his routes, and participated in briefings with agents and authorities. Life had returned to motion, but it was motion tempered by vigilance, careful observation, and a deep understanding of the stakes. Every stop along the highway carried a renewed significance. Larry approached each lot with eyes wide open, assessing lighting, the presence of other vehicles, and the angles from which someone might approach a rig unnoticed. He scanned the peripheries for oddities, subtle deviations from the expected. Each inspection became more than habit. It was ritual, a combination of skill, knowledge, and instinct honed by experience and reinforced by necessity. He could feel the difference in his attention. Every clink, every vibration, every shadow was noticed, registered, and processed. The road had always demanded focus, but now it demanded awareness of forces beyond mere mechanics. Despite the weight of these responsibilities, Larry found a renewed sense of purpose. He began mentoring younger drivers, sharing insights about equipment integrity, subtle warning signs, and the importance of meticulous observation. Conversations at rest stops shifted from casual camaraderie to subtle lessons in vigilance. He emphasized listening, noticing, and trusting one's instincts. Even as the larger investigation continued in the background, his influence extended outward quietly, protecting others in ways unseen, shaping behavior and attention in a profession where a single oversight could prove catastrophic. The broader criminal network remained at large, in part, adapting its strategies, but Larry's experience and testimony had disrupted a significant portion of its operations. Arrests and prosecutions followed, and policies at truck stops and maintenance facilities began to shift toward tighter security and verification procedures. The presence of oversight cameras, restricted access, and more rigorous inspection routines became standard, a direct result of the incidents he had been involved in. Larry observed these changes with a mixture of satisfaction and vigilance. While they did not guarantee safety, they represented progress, a recognition of vulnerabilities previously ignored. He resumed long-haul drives with a sense of both routine and alertness. The engine's hum became a companion, the vibrations through the chassis a signal of both continuity and caution. He monitored gauges and structural integrity, checked for anomalies, and maintained logs with renewed rigor. The familiarity of the road provided solace, but the lessons of the previous months ensured he never relaxed to the point of complacency. Each mile was a balance of confidence and caution, skill tempered by awareness. Larry's reputation among peers evolved. Other drivers, aware of his experience and his direct involvement in the investigation, sought his guidance. He shared strategies for proactive inspections, early detection of tampering, and safe handling of unusual occurrences. These interactions extended beyond advice. They created a network of vigilance, a chain of awareness stretching across rest stops and highways, reinforcing the importance of responsibility and attentiveness in daily operations. As the days passed, Larry began to view the road not simply as a means of transport, but as a space demanding respect, observation, and integrity. Every stop, every interaction, every minor noise held potential significance. The lessons he had learned became embedded in his consciousness, shaping not only his actions but his perceptions. He was no longer merely a driver. He was a sentinel, attuned to threats that were invisible to most, his experience serving as both shield and guide. The truck, now fully restored and inspected, felt familiar but transformed in his perception. It was not a simple machine. It was a partner whose integrity required constant attention. Every panel, every seam, every fixture was observed with renewed care. The road remained unpredictable, but Larry's approach had changed. Caution and experience combined to create a vigilance that was now instinctive, almost unconscious. In the final moments of the afternoon, as the sun dipped behind distant hills, Larry reflected on the journey from discovery to resolution. The network that had used his truck was disrupted, the immediate threat neutralized, and procedures improved. Yet, he knew the work of vigilance was unending. He adjusted his mirrors, checked his gauges, and took a slow breath, feeling the rhythm of the engine beneath him. The highway stretched ahead, its asphalt glimmering in the fading light. He shifted into gear and moved forward, carrying the lessons, the awareness, and the resolve he had gained. The road was the same, yet nothing would ever be quite the same again. The sound of the engine, the wind against the mirrors, the distant hum of other vehicles, all were now signals, reminders, and guides. The journey continued, but Larry Davis had changed. He was a man shaped by experience, alert to the subtleties of the world, aware that vigilance and integrity could save lives, protect others, and preserve the fragile trust between man and machine. The road stretched onward, endless, and he drove with purpose, carrying the weight of knowledge, the clarity of experience, and the unspoken responsibility of awareness into every mile ahead. If you found this story as shocking as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next unbelievable discoveries. Don't stop here. Check out our other videos for more jaw-dropping tales that will leave you speechless. And share this video with your friends to see their reactions. They won't believe what's